economic calculation into their needs. This is a phrase attributed to Karl Marx, which I have never found in one of his works, but it is recognized as the essence of the socialist proposal, that no one should have more than they need, that everyone should have an equal level of comfort, that no one should be forced to work more than necessary because they're less productive or capable of having the same level of comfort as other people. This objective is the guide used by Marx for the ideal society, one in which there is no need for more than they need. The oppressed and oppressor classes, as he saw them in society, basically focused on the accumulation of capital and private property, beyond money itself, and given the world's problems, particularly inequality, his proposal to solve the problem was to replace money and private property with a mechanism of economic planning. Therefore, it's necessary to understand that the socialist solution for social organization consists of two distinct mechanisms. One is the planning of the economy instead of the free market, where each person freely negotiates the value of their goods and services. The economy would be planned by a central organization, an economic committee, a community vote, or any other mechanism that would define how much each person would have to work and how much each person would receive for each good. In this situation, money becomes unnecessary, as does private property. Additionally, this committee, in planning the economy, would do so with the objective of making people more equal, giving more resources to those who need more resources, larger families, sick people, etc., and determining the amount of work to be done by each according to their capacity to work and the needs of all. Note that these are two things. The first proposal is independent of the second. You can have a planned economy, but with a different objective than giving to each according to their needs. A planned economy to favor a group of people, for example, a race or politicians and public officials, so you can have the first part and the second, but the second part depends on the first. To give to each according to their needs, you will need to stay in the economy. The free market doesn't do that. The main criticisms of socialism have always been aimed at attacking the second part, for example, the issue of incentives. If people receive according to their needs, they have no incentive to work. The tendency is for them to work less, leading to low productivity and lack of products, hunger, scarcity of resources. If you're going to receive the same as an engineer or a garbage collector, why invest years in a college? Furthermore, it is undeniable that such a model places subjective criteria in the hands of decision makers, such as deciding who needs more resources and therefore who will receive more resources. In the end, it is enormous power in the hands of those who decide where the resources will be allocated, and this ends up making these people very powerful. In the end, the Soviet nomenclature, the Soviet state bureaucracy, showed this well, with government leaders becoming super powerful and literally living like the old magnates they sought to eradicate. These criticisms of the second part never The issue of incentives remains a central criticism of communism. As we explained in the video, meritocracy exists, but it was not. Furthermore, it showed that the first part, merely a fully planned economy, was impossible in itself because it becomes completely unfeasible to make decisions about the allocation of resources and factors of production. Whatever the objective of the planned economy, it is impossible to plan, impossible to function if it encompasses the entire economy. Note that parts of an economy can be planned. In fact, companies are exactly small bubbles of economic planning. The market, even if a company fulfills its obligations by inputs and sells products in a free market, within the company the decisions about what to produce, how to produce, who to employ, and how to pay for labor are made with central planning, not by the free market. It is the board of directors that determines the allocation of resources, from department directors who decide on investments in their areas, all the way down to the employee who will carry out orders and work as required. There are even companies that function as an encapsulated free market, such as Uber, iFood, and other apps that basically put people in contact to perform services. In a free market, there are also companies that use internal market mechanisms where a department, you can choose to buy services from another department of the company or from another company, but even within these companies, there is some central planning, unlike most traditional companies. And what prevails is explicitly a typical and standard central planning. Therefore, economic calculation of part of the economy is indeed possible and sometimes even desirable, as we demonstrated in our video, because the state will disappear, but this can exist in a part of the economy, as we demonstrate. Not in its entirety, which is what is required by the socialist model. Its central point is that the central part of a social organization is the allocation of resources. This needs to be done regardless of the government. Economic calculation consists of society making informed decisions about which resource to apply in each situation in order to optimize the allocation of scarce resources. This is the problem with economic calculation. There are decisions that need to be made about scarce resources. You make decisions of this type every day about what to buy with your salary, which is the return you receive for your work. But in economic terms, a certain strip of land, for example, can be used to plant beans or onions. How is this decision made in the free market? This area has an owner. The owner of the area will seek information about the best option, the one that will, to give him more personal return. Look, it's not just profit but personal return. For example, he might not like planting beans but rather onions. Therefore, even calculating the monetary profit of the story, he will profit if he plants one thing or the other. If he concludes that the profit from beans would be only slightly greater than the profit from onions, he may still choose to plant onions because he prefers that, his personal taste. But if the profit from beans is much greater than the profit from onions, well, he will change his mind. It's not just his personal taste that matters, it's also a mixture of both things, monetary return and personal return. Every decision, and as Amisis correctly observes, has a quantifiable component, the monetary value of that transaction, but it also has a non-quantifiable value, a component of personal taste, of personal preference. The landowner in the capitalist system will make this decision, and the fact that he uses that area to plant one thing or another will have an infinitesimal influence on the price of those things in the market, on the price of beans and onions, because if he chooses to plant one thing, there will be a little more supply of beans or onions in the market, and with that, the price of that product will fall. A tiny infinitesimal difference will affect the price of a single producer, and the price of another will also rise a tiny infinitesimal difference. This way, their decision influences other people, who may alter their decisions based on this change. An important point here is that the value of something to a person goes beyond monetary value. For example, the construction of a hydroelectric dam to generate electricity will destroy a very beautiful waterfall in the region. How do you calculate the value of the waterfall's beauty? There's no way to Quantify in reais, resilient currency, the loss to the people who will no longer be able to admire its beauty. You can calculate the rest, the cost of the dam, the cement, the bricks, the work of the engineer and the construction workers. The price of electricity on the market will bring profit. But the lost beauty of that waterfall will always be a subjective value. But up to this point, we are talking about a deficiency in the capitalist price system compared to the free market. Currency, the value in reais, only measures part of the value of something at the moment of decision-making, at the moment of economic calculation. Now imagine even more complex decisions involving means of production. You have a good quantity of steel is needed, and you need to decide whether to use it to build a railroad to make cutlery for people, or to build an iron ore mining plant to have more steel in the future. Note that there will always be some subjective factor in the decision, but this decision is extremely complex. If you invest in a new iron ore production plant, you will have more steel in the future, but you still don't have a railroad. This distinction between lower order and higher order products is called a railroad. All lower order products are those that can be created directly from commodities. You create beans or onions from soil, seeds, water, fertilizer, and labor. It's a relatively simple process. There are few levels of products used. A decision that, if made now, doesn't prove to be a good decision, can be changed in the next room. However, an iron ore mining plant is a higher order product. You have iron ore mining, steel production plants, coal mines, a long-term plan involving millions of basic inputs of various types, countless hours of work, and countless people in various professions. You don't need to go that far. A pencil is a higher order product. There's also a Friedman video we talk about, which is really cool. Although the monetary value doesn't represent the total value of an asset, it provides the entire basis for calculating the monetary value of that asset. Only the final construction decision involves incorporating the subjective value when making the decision about the railroad. The wise manager considers the inputs he needs directly. These inputs are formed by thousands of other inputs in a huge chain that can even include feedback loops, but he doesn't need to calculate all of that because these inputs have a market price. He only needs to consider their market price, the financial return he will get from that product, to establish the entire monetary part of the decision. Of course, the subjective factor still needs to be taken into account, but he only needs to worry about the subjective factor of his decision here. All the thousands of subjective factors, the decisions that were made throughout the entire production chain to arrive at the direct inputs he needs, have already been calculated by the market. They're already in the prices of these inputs. This is the advantage of capitalism. A planner in capitalism, when making the economic calculation, can calculate all the costs based on market values, and only in the final decision will he include his subjectivity in the final decision. But remember that to have prices, to have monetary values for our calculation of total value, a free market is necessary. For producers to be able to offer their products to whoever wants to buy them, there needs to be a currency, money, a means of exchange to allow the calculation of monetary value and the universal exchange of products. In this way, in a society like the one we live in today, although there is no free market but rather a regulated market, there are still prices, both for commodities or inputs and for lower order products, and also for higher order products. You can calculate all aspects of a decision by applying only your subjective value associated with that decision. Remember that the decision to consume a good also fits into this logic. You have the cost of two food options. For example, two different dishes. You can eat feijoada, Brazilian stew, or a 1L cheeseburger. You know the price of these options. You only need to apply your subjectivity to these dishes when deciding which one you will eat, or if not, whether you will go on a diet today. But so far we are explaining the price system and decisions, the economic calculation in capitalism. Now let's transport this to a planned society, with central economic planning outlining what each person will do and how much each will receive in resources, it's easy to see that. Calculating how much of each product should be produced to meet each person's needs is theoretically possible, although it's an extremely complex task because it's not just about distributing what's produced to those who will consume it, and it's not just about lower-order products, it's necessary to consider future planning and the factors of production themselves. For higher-order products, it's necessary to use steel to build railroads that will transport goods to a city, build another iron ore extraction plant, to have more steel in the future, or use the steel in cutlery for the population to consume. You have to build machines for the higher-order product. Decisions need to be made about the distribution of tasks to all people, all land, and all existing factors of production. Speaking about the level of complexity of such a task in practice, as explained in the video, what is the tragedy of integers? Calculating what should be produced by whom in each situation in an economy is theoretically possible using, for example, a linear programming method. However, this is an NP complex problem, that is, small problems tend to be easily solved, but the processing time required increases. In practice, exponentially increasing costs are impossible to solve for any complex case, let alone for an entire country's economy. There's even a joke by a Russian economist who estimated that using linear programming he could certainly calculate next year's budget, but that it would take 80 years to complete the calculation. But look, this is the point of contention. The point of contention goes beyond that. As we saw with a free market price system, subjective value only enters the decision-making process in the final stage, usually by the person affected by subjectivity. Each person's subjectivity infinitesimally influences market prices, allowing other people to make their subjective decisions. Faced with a new price reality, but since there is no price system in socialism, ultimately the socialist system will have to decide what people subjectively want, whether to go to the theatre or the cinema, for example, whether they prefer to drink wine or beer. The bureaucrat will have to make such decisions in advance, considering that he needs to plan how much of each will be produced. This may not seem very difficult at first. You can look at the statistics of people who chose the theatre or the cinema. It turned over, and in the previous year, but this approach has the problem that it fixes the percentage because now that it has been decided by planning, people cannot change their choice. If people change their preference, you have no way of knowing this information because there is no price system to be infinitesimally affected by the personal decisions of each individual. Their decision has already been made beforehand, it was planned, you froze personal preference in time, limiting it to the last year you had a free market where people could effectively choose what to do. This becomes even worse with the invention of new products. How do you know if people prefer simple cell phones or smartphones, something that didn't exist before? How do you know the manufacturing point of each and who to deliver to? This is the point of the miss. A communist society can function adequately for some time with the memory of market prices that existed before, with the subjective decisions that existed previously, but invariably, as the population changes its consumption habits or new products and goods are created, effective planning becomes impossible. There is simply no data capable of doing such a calculation. It is not merely a situation where doing the calculation is very difficult, requiring a quantum computer 1,000 times more powerful than what we have now is simply impossible to do such planning without a price system, and it's impossible in a price system without a free market and private property. Remember that we are talking about optimized economic planning, because what happens in practice is that Russian bureaucrats established random production quotas in absurdly ineffective plans. There are jokes about factories with production quotas for screws per ton of steel, which in this way produced enormous, super heavy screws that had no real use. This happened routinely in the Soviet Union. It's conceivable that Russian bureaucrats were capable of inventing some kind of plan every year. The point here is that it's Impossible for such planning to be efficient. The random planning done by bureaucrats doesn't produce the things that people actually want to consume, because even if they were well-intentioned, even if they had absurdly powerful computers, there wouldn't be enough data to do this planning, because there's no way to incorporate personal preference in this case. The economic calculation is, it's impossible in socialism. There's no way to optimally calculate central planning for an entire economy, because this works for companies. The company itself is a decision subject to the market. If a company isn't efficient in its internal planning, it will be overtaken by other companies or individuals. The market dictates that the company uses the prices of its inputs and other monetized values, along with the subjectivity of its controllers, exactly as a normal person makes any decision. But this only works with a hierarchical structure of central planning being a small part of the economy, because other people and companies guarantee that there will be a market for prices for both inputs and final products. If the entire economy is planned, there's no way to determine prices. Therefore, there's no way to plan. In other words, what has been demonstrated to me is that even if, by magic, human nature were altered, and people started working without personal incentives, no longer caring about working more even if they received less, for the good of society, even if all rulers and bureaucrats were capable and well-intentioned, this wouldn't work logically. In practice, Mrs. Criticism only adds to other criticisms about incentives, human morality, etc., which shows that this type of social organization is incapable of generating good results in practice, especially clearly demonstrating the theoretical justification behind the inevitable failures observed whenever such an ideology is attempted in practice. In any situation, you may have noticed that I am using the word socialism as a synonym for communism. In fact, there is no qualitative difference between the two in practice. Even at the height of the Soviet-planned economy, some prices on the black market were formed and used for economic calculations by the government. It is only a difference of degree, not of quality. As planning becomes more centralized, economic calculation becomes less efficient. This shows why countries with a high degree of freedom, hi Monica, I'm more prosperous, have more efficient economic calculations and decision-making. On the other hand, situations like Banana Republic and even worse cases like Madeline prove once again that the more central planning, the worse the efficiency of the economy. It is important to emphasize that there were several responses to this article by socialist theorists. They responded in various ways. One of the first to counter-argue being the socialist economist Enrico Barone, whose criticism was later repeated by several other economists. His criticism basically stated that economic calculation based on linear programming and other mathematical methods is possible, but we've already discussed this. Mrs. objection is greater than that. Static calculation using linear programming is theoretically possible, as Miss himself admits, although even with current computers it is totally impractical. The same as theoretically possible is a static view. It doesn't take into account the evolution of customs, new habits of the population, as well as new products. There's no way to include a boundary condition for a new product in linear programming because you don't know if people will actually want to use that product. The biggest criticism was made by a Polish economist named Oskar Lang, who recognized the validity of the problem. Pointed out by Miss, he acknowledged that there was a problem in socialism, but proposed a way to deal with it based on a method he called trial and error. This consisted of developing a feedback loop based on planning done using the last time the capitalist system functioned. For example, in the case of choosing between cinema and theatre, one starts with the last data when people still had freedom of choice. From there, it is expected that in a planned economy, theatres and cinemas report any changes in public interest. For example, if more people wanted to see the cinema this year than the theatre, then central planning could be altered the following year to accommodate this change. However, it's obvious that such a solution is clearly inefficient compared to the price system, since the feedback loop would be much longer in a free market. If demand for a good increases, the price increases immediately. That is, the feedback is very fast. In the mechanism proposed by Lang, it's much slower, inevitably leading to optimized planning. But this isn't the main problem with the mechanism I propose by Lang. The real problem is that it assumes that we know in advance what parameters to measure for planning. The following year, not the example we gave between theatre and cinema. How do we know that demand is no longer just about YouTube? How do we know what alternatives exist that people might be choosing? Since the possibility of planned feedback always requires some level of predictability about the options, it becomes clear that it's equally impossible to implement, both theoretically and practically. In the end, Miss generated several versions of his paper over the years, clarifying points attacked by these socialist theorists, Ryer, who also published papers detailing Miss's proposal, and including the fact of information asymmetry, proving that it is mathematically impossible for a management group to have all the information present in society. Didn't need to change a single line in his argument, which was always the same. He never sought to use socialist economic calculation. It was impossible in practice. It is impossible in theory as well, and that is the central point. The solutions proposed based on linear programming calculation are, by chance, also possible in practice, but that was never the central point of the argument. In any case, socialist theorists sought strawmen to combat Miss's argument until the 1980s. Curiously, when the Soviet Union economically disintegrated in that decade, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the access that the rest of the world gained to information about how things actually worked in the Soviet Union, the discussion ended. Mises got all his predictions right. Soviet economists used market prices for their planning because it was better than any medical mechanism they could effectively use. The sum of changes in habits and new technology products, they transformed Soviet industry into worthless scrap. My point of view on this was that they only failed to make it clear that although a market with state regulation allows for economic calculation, the more regulated the state was, the more economic planning generated. If you want peak economic efficiency, there is only one way: a completely free market without any regulation, without taxes, without law, without government. One day the Berlin Wall of the democratic rule of law will fall, and we will all realize that we were forced into an economically inefficient system. Government doesn't work. Economic calculation is impossible in the stadium, so it is too. And thank you for watching.